Just want to make sure it is recording. Yep, there we go. Okay. Today's presentation is going to be on interactions between insect stress and drought stress. Our speaker is Desireè Wickwar from the University of Idaho. Desireè is the IPM coordinator or Integrated Pest Management Program coordinator at University of Idaho. Her background is in ecology entomology with an MS from Utah State University, excuse me. She's sorry, trying to remember these things is really hard. So she studied insect management, including research in the interplay between drought stress, drought resistance, and arthropod outbreaks in a number of plant insect systems. So she's here today to talk to us more about that topic, and I will hand it over to Desireè and let her share her screen.
All right. Thanks, Carrie. Okay. Successfully shared, hopefully.
Yep, I can confirm it is there.
All right, great. Okay, let's get started. Like Carrie said, I am extremely interested in the interaction between drought stress and insect stress. So we'll talk a lot about that. If I can advance my slide. Okay, so yeah, what we'll talk about is first, what is drought stress? I know we think we know exactly what that is, but I think some of the details are important. We'll talk about how plants defend themselves, what conditions favor insect outbreaks, why do these things oftentimes overlap, the role of drought resistance and tolerance in this interaction, and what you can do to prevent damage. And one caveat I will give before we get started, and that Carrie sort of alluded to in my intro, is that I'm an entomologist. I'm not an irrigation specialist. I'm not a soil scientist. So I am good at the insect side of this, and I am very interested in the other facets of it, and I'll do my best to answer all questions. But know that I come to it from an entomological background. Okay, so technically, what is drought stress? So drought stress is the physiological challenges or the stresses that plants face when water availability is insufficient to meet their metabolic needs. So that's kind of complicated. So let's break it down. So first, let's talk about what do we mean when we say when water availability is insufficient to meet metabolic needs? Okay, so water availability. To understand water availability, we have to understand how soil and water interact with plant roots, essentially, right? So we have to understand the continuum of water, the amount of water in a soil. So on the left side of this diagram, what you can see is a fully saturated soil. That's a common term we see, right? Well, saturation means that the soil can't actually hold all of the water that's present. So the force of gravity by itself is enough to pull the water through the soil. Soil particles inherently like to hold on to water. But at a certain point, they don't have enough strength, essentially, to hold on to the amount of water there. And so when we have saturation, what we have is the amount of water is greater than the soil can hold on to. So while there is water available for a plant in this situation when soil is saturated, what there isn't available is air. And, while there are plants that are equipped to deal with saturated soils, in the states represented in this webinar, we generally don't have that problem of saturated soil for very long, at bare minimum, right? So usually saturated soil can be a problem for plants. Next, the one little section to the right, what we have is field capacity. This is a really important term in irrigation and in soil, so you've probably heard it. Essentially, what field capacity is the water in the soil and the soil's holding capacity are equal. So the soil can just hold all the water that's present. It's kind of like full to the brim. But ideally, what this does mean is that plants' roots have the strength to pull that water off. It's not so tightly bound to the soil molecules that the water is inaccessible to plants, but there's also a little bit of pore space. There's also a little bit of air. So those roots can kind of get some breathing space. And then as we move kind of towards the drier side, what we see is an increase in those pore spaces, an increase in the amount of air that's around. So the soil is still being able to hold all the water that's present, and roots are still able to pull some of it off, but we're seeing a little bit of increase in the air. And then on the far right, as the wilting plants would suggest, we have another unideal scenario where even though there is some water available, or there's some water in the soil, you can see these little blue lines around each soil particle, that water is really tightly bound to the soil. Like I said earlier, soil likes to hold on to water. And so it's holding on to that little amount so tightly that the roots of plants can't pull it off. And so what we'll hear this called sometimes is the permanent wilting point. And just as that term sounds kind of scary, it is. It's basically at that permanent wilting point, there's significant lasting damage done to our plants from that lack of water. So what we're aiming for, ideally, when we're irrigating or just in an ideal environment, is we're aiming for somewhere between field capacity at the upper end. We don't want any higher because with saturation, we're just losing water. And we don't want to go to the permanent wilting point. So we're aiming for something in this center area. So that's the optimum water availability. However, that sounds really nice, right? Like, oh, that's very clean. There must be a clear upper and a lower limit. Unfortunately, this gets really messy. And again, I'm not a soil scientist, so I don't have all of the details on this, but the 10,000 foot view is basically that different soil types hold on to different amounts of water. So I picked this little small table here on the right side of your screen where we can see, oh yeah, it's going to have a pointer, where we can see, just as an example, there's how much water, so in inches of water per foot of soil, that's what this table's units are in. So a sandy soil, for instance, well, it's field capacity. So the very most it can hold on to is 2 inches of water per foot of soil. But then if you go up to a silty clay loam, what you're going to see is it's able to hold on to about twice that much water. So there's a lot of variability in the kind of soil that you have and how much water it's going to be able to hold on to. Oh, and then I will put in the chat. If you want some more details on this, there's a good publication you can see. Okay, so we talked about the water availability part of this equation. What about the physiological challenges that the plant's facing? What exactly is happening at that physiological level? So we all probably have some answers to this. Put in the chat, what happens to plants when they lack water in general? This can be from the most basic to the most metabolite-oriented answers. They wilt. Yeah, that's a huge one. Wilt and lose some color. Yeah, they can die. All kinds of things are possible. Yeah, all kinds of bad things. We don't like any of the things that we're listing here, right? So why are these things happening at an actual metabolic level? So plants, they need water for a bunch of different purposes. They need water to undergo photosynthesis, right? We know that water is such an important molecule when it comes to just plants making energy. They need it for nutrient transport, like I saw someone said in the chat. They need water as to create like that soluble environment for the nutrients they're trying to transport around their system. They also need water for transpiration and temperature regulation. This is one that maybe we don't think about as much. When plants don't have enough water, their leaf surface temperature increases really drastically. And they're unable to regulate their own temperature because they're stuck in one place, right? They can't go sit in the shade or whatnot. And of course, then for structural support and turgor pressure, all these things, every single cell is supported by water. So yeah, water is a really key component. So what exactly is happening when a plant doesn't have enough water to undergo all of those important processes that it supports. Stomatal closure is one. So leaves have these little pores where they do uh, exchange of gases, right? And what they're trying to do when they close those pores is they're like, whoa, I can't handle any more evaporation of water through those pores, so they have to close them. But that means that a lot of other processes have to stop. So they can't take in or exhaust any gases. So basically that means reduced photosynthesis. Um, there's also reduced nutrient uptake. So if there isn't the favorable osmotic environment, the favorable placement and movement of water within the plant, they can't move nutrients. We see things like increased leaf shedding and wilting and altered root systems. This is the plant's attempt to alter its tissues to deal with the fact that it doesn't have enough water. And ultimately, we see stunted growth and indeed death, like many of you pointed out in the chat, and I failed to include in that list. But it's a very real potential, right? Okay, but plants do fight back. So they're sessile, they can't move, but they're not inert. Let's put it in the chat again. What do plants usually do to fight back against things like drought stress or just stressors in general? Like insect stress is another one. What do plants do to defend themselves? Drop leaves. Yeah, I see. Okay, it looks like people can only chat with us. Perhaps you could open up their ability to share stuff with everyone. I don't know if that's possible. Yeah, diverting energy, attracting beneficial insects, curling up leaves. Yeah, that's a really good one. Sometimes kind of again protecting themselves from water loss, slowing their growth. Yeah, all these kinds of things. So plants do fight back, and they fight back in a number of different ways. So one option for how plants fight back is they resist the pest or the stressor. So they might basically they limit the impact of that stressor. I put these examples in terms of resistance to insect stress, for instance. So if a plant is resistant to a stressor, it limits that the pest multiplication. So it doesn't even, it's not impacted by it, it just completely resists it. It stops it from being a problem. Or it can tolerate a stressor or a pest. So when it tolerates it, what it means is it actually reduces the effect of something like an infestation or a stressor on its fitness. So let's give some examples of that. So for resistance, what that means is perhaps the accumulation of chemicals toxic to a pest. It's resisting damage. The pest is still there, but it accumulates some of these chemicals so that pest isn't able to multiply so quickly. So it's resisting its presence, not just letting it kind of get out of hand. On the other hand, what we have is tolerance. So again, that's basically being able to just overcome things. An example of that would be the ability to still produce good yield despite of defoliation from a pest. So there are many different ways that plants do this, and we'll get into some of the examples here in a second. So there are physical defenses that plants have against stressors. Particularly, I'm going to focus in a little bit on drought stress and insect stress. And this is far from an exhaustive list, but these are just some examples. So physical defenses, you can imagine things like thorns and spines and trichomes. Those are all going to be good examples of things that would deter insect feeders. If they can't actually get to the plant tissue, then they're not going to be able to damage it. They can have thick or tough leaves. So that can not only reduce the loss of water, if you have essentially when you have a really thick leaf, is you have less surface area per unit volume. And we know that the more surface area you have, the more you're going to have water loss. So thick leaves can help with that, and tough leaves can basically make it harder for insects to either pierce through them, if there's something like a piercing sucking insect like an aphid, or maybe something like a Colorado potato beetle. That's a chewing insect. It can be harder for them to chew through. So it takes them more time to get the nutrients and more effort to get the nutrients that they need. Bark is another great one, and other sort of defensive tissues, kind of along that line of tough tissue. Keeps in water, tries its best to keep out pests. Thick epicuticular wax, that means wax on the outside of the leaves or the vegetative structure. Keeps water in, is not a great thing for an insect to pierce through or to chew through. And altered root systems. So, plants might delve deeper if there's deeper water, or delve broader if they just need only surface water. All these kinds of physical defenses against stress. There are also chemical defenses. And again, this is a far from exhaustive list, just kind of honing in on insect and drought stress. But plants are able to generate a ton of different compounds. Oftentimes we'll call these secondary metabolites or proteins that are toxic or harmful to pests, as an example, or they might help reduce stress. So, we know that when a plant doesn't have enough water, that means it's not able to move nutrients out once. Well, it might produce some compounds that help facilitate it still moving those nutrients throughout the system, even in the absence of water. Or again, there are classic examples of secondary metabolites that help plants defend against insects. They might be toxic to those insects. Jasminates are the ones that I put just a little diagram of here. The chemical structure isn't important, but that happens to just be some things that plants produce that are generally not great for insect growth and survival. And as I saw someone actually point out in the chat, plants can also release volatile compounds that they are using to defend themselves. They can't move, so they can't go to beneficial organisms, but they can bring beneficial organisms to themselves. So they can attract natural enemies, which I think is really so interesting. What'll happen is an herbivorous insect will chew on a plant, and that will trigger that plant to release a compound that attracts that herbivorous insect's natural enemy. Really powerful. They can also release things that just sort of repel harmful insects, kind of smell bad sort of thing. And they can also release volatile compounds. You usually heard these termed VOCs. They can release VOCs that induce defense responses in the plants next to them. So you imagine that they're basically helping protect all the plants around them, particularly of the same species, to basically say, uh-oh, like there's a pest over here, and they can have their neighbors upregulate or intensify those defenses, knowing that there's that pest in that area. They're really very active plants. Okay, but we know that these things can be an arm race, plants versus insects, a battle as old as time. So then what happens when insects fight back? How do they overcome those defenses? Plants are doing a lot, but what are insects doing to kind of fight back? Sometimes the conditions just favor insect outbreaks. What's going to happen is things like hot weather. Obviously, this is going to facilitate drought oftentimes, but a great thing for insects in hot weather is we know that their growth and development is contingent upon the outside temperature. They don't regulate their own internal temperature. Instead, they use the outside temperature kind of as their own. So when things are hot, what you see is faster development. And generally, that's why we see big booms of insects. Stressed host plants are also great for insects. Decreased defenses is what we see, right? A plant that's already devoting all of its resources to one stressor is going to have a tough time pivoting and using limited energy to then defend against another. So oftentimes what we see when our plants are doing really bad is a combination of stressors, right? This can occur with, a disease in an insect just as easily as drought in an insect. So pre-stressed plants are already going to favor insect outbreaks. Reduced growth rate is another one. This isn't necessarily going to favor an insect outbreak, but it is going to really be not ideal in the plant overcoming insect damage. So what we usually want is when we see a plant, we're like, oh, like I hope it can grow out of that damage. Well, if a plant is already stressed, it's not devoting energy towards growth, towards creating new tissue that can kind of overcome that damage. So when we see reduced growth rate, that's another time where we're going to really worry about insect outbreaks. Um, Stressed host plants, even though they can release compounds that help attract beneficials, sadly, they also release compounds that attract their pests. Not intentionally, but it's basically the pests smelling like, oh, there's a stressed plant over there. It's probably a pretty easy target. So that's going to be something that's going to help those insects find those plants that don't have those defenses in place. Abundant nutrients is also something, of course, that can favor insect outbreaks. So that can just be things like it has a lot of its host plant available. But an interesting way that this interplays with drought stress is basically, when we see a plant wilt, what's happening is it has less water in those tissues, right? It's not able to pump up those cells in order to keep it structurally stable. And what that means for an insect is actually it's ideal. Insects aren't limited by how much water they need as much as by how much sugars and nitrogen they need. So what happens when a plant is drought stressed is that it doesn't have as much water in that tissue, but that is actually great because for insects then, per bite or per slurp, that means they're getting more nutrients, so they can more effectively eat and grow when there actually isn't as much water available, even though for us that seems counterintuitive. So to kind of summarize how these things interplay, unfortunately for us, oftentimes the effects of drought stress are exactly what causes insects to become really damaging or to severely outbreak. So, as examples, when a plant is drought stressed, we know it closes its leaf stomata, right? What that means is that the leaf surface temperature is going to increase. An insect exists in a very small space. The leaf surface temperature is actually more important, especially for small insects, than the ambient temperature. So when that leaf surface temperature increases, those small little insects are really feeling that leaf surface temperature very distinctively. Of course, when a plant is drought stressed, like I've been saying, it has decreased energy for defense. So sadly, that's usually going to cause insect outbreaks, maybe secondary infections, all kinds of things. Increased concentration of nutrients happens when a plant is drought stressed. That's going to be great for insects. Oftentimes, most notably, those piercing, sucking kind of insects, your quintessential ones like aphids, psyllids, those sorts of things. Reduced growth of new tissue is going to be problematic for us. Drought stressed plants aren't usually growing really vigorously, and then we're going to see our damage. Even if we have an equal amount of damage in a well-watered plant versus a drought stressed plant, that well-watered plant's going to be able to cover it up. Emission of distress signals happens when we have drought stress, and that's going to be problematic. Yeah, and all these other kinds of risks. The last two on this list, I put a little asterisk by because there's times where this gets a little bit gray, but just as again, like things for us to think about as we're managing plants in a water limited environment. Sometimes another problem with drought stress for us is that we have reduced performance of systemic insecticides we might want to use, and insecticides in general, but particularly with systemics. What we're hoping is that a plant can uptake those compounds into its tissue to defend against an insect, to kill that insect, basically. And we can't have that if we have reduced movement of that compound through the plant body. Reduced impact of fertilizer application, or indeed, we might not even be able to make fertilizer applications in a drought stress environment. Then we end up with salt stress in many cases, right? Um, so yeah, what we want to do to help our plants in times of overlapping stressors is just, reduce any stress that we can. But a problem that we have with this drought situation is we usually can't fertilize, and that's going to be, it's not going to help us promote health in that plant as much as we want. Again, especially if we're in a water limited environment and we can't just water willy-nilly. All right, so that was a lot of information. And so I thought what we would do is also just go over some quick case studies that are from some of my past research and work that kind of demonstrated this exact these kind of patterns that I'm talking about. So first we'll talk about billbugs in turfgrass. Do people know what billbugs are? I'm curious to hear. They are my favorite weevil. Um, yes. Oh, hi, Kelly. Kelly was uh on my grad school panel. Um, so billbugs are a problem in turfgrass. So it's actually this larval form on the right-hand side that's the problem. Um, and I did some research to basically see how does billbug stress interplay with drought stress, and how might we be able to get around some of these problems. So dry conditions, essentially, I guess I'll go back. What I did is I first wanted to monitor, are these insects actually more abundant in dry areas? And the short answer to that is yes. So what this graph shows is you'll see the total number of billbugs present here on the left side of the graph on that y-axis. And then on this horizontal axis, you see the soil moisture at these traps when I was collecting this data. And maybe it's not super apparent, but at a statistical level, what we really see is that low soil moisture, so over here on the left side of this graph, was highly predictive of there being more billbugs. So again, just a data point that says, something's going on in this system, probably many factors, but in those drier conditions, we're generally seeing more billbugs, whereas in these really wet conditions, we're really not seeing them as much. Another thing we wanted to look at was the interplay between billbug resistance, so insect resistance in general, and resistance to drought. And again, these graphs are kind of messy, but let's run through them. So this was done in turfgrass, where there's two different measures that we have of types of drought resistance. So what you see on the one hand is wilting resistance. Sorry, I made this text so small, but wilting resistance is a type of drought resistance. It's basically the plant's ability to maintain its turgor pressure and maintain its form despite the fact that it's water limited. And then on the other hand, we have resistance to dormancy. If you have a lawn, you probably know that what can sometimes happen when our grasses get really drought stressed is that they just go dormant. They turn brown. They don't necessarily die, but they go brown. And neither one of those things is ideal. So those are the types of drought resistance we're going to be talking about. And then for each one of these graphs, what we see is the measured billbug resistance of a particular cultivar versus that type of drought resistance. So this comes from a huge data set from the National Turfgrass Evaluation Program, and basically there are hundreds and hundreds of turfgrass cultivars that they characterize. So what you see in this left-hand graph is basically when there's low wilting resistance of these cultivars, there's generally reduced resistance to something like a billbug. They're basically doing more damage to those varieties versus when there's high wilting resistance, when they're really resistant to wilting and when they're resistant to drought in that form, they're usually pretty billbug resistant as well. And you see the exact same thing with dormancy. Generally, if a turfgrass cultivar is really prone to going dormant under drought conditions, it's also going to be really prone to getting billbug damage and vice versa. Of course, there's a ton of caveats here, right? Like we see a big scatter, and there's many, many different ways that plants can be resistant or tolerant to drought, and many, many different ways that plants can be resistant or tolerant to insect stress. But as a general trend, that's kind of what we see. So why is that happening? Well, generally, the things that can help us confer drought resistance are also things that can help confer insect resistance. So all the things that we were talking about earlier that are great plant defenses. So things like tougher leaf tissue, bad for insects, great for drought resistance. Thicker wax, also great to avoid water loss while being harder for insects to chew through. And accumulated defense chemicals. Now, of course, this is where a big caveat is there's many, many different ways that plants can be drought resistant and many, many different ways that plants can be insect resistant, but some of the chemicals that they accumulate can serve double duty. And at least in the case of these chewing, root feeding insects, that's how billbugs cause damage. Sometimes deeper rooting can help them as well. So again, just a little bit of a case study that shows the kind of patterns we're talking about. Okay, case study number 2. This one was actually the interaction between drought resistance and level of irrigation, so drought stress as well, and spider mite outbreaks in corn. And spider mites are the bane of so many existences, so hopefully this one's an even more familiar pest. Okay, so the two kind of questions that we're going to be addressing in this study are, one, how does drought stress influence the severity of spider mite outbreaks? And two, do drought tolerant and drought susceptible varieties have different outbreak severities? So kind of following up on those same questions that we just looked at, but in a different system in many ways. Okay, so I won't delve really deeply into the experimental setup, but understanding the treatments that we had in this experiment is kind of important to understanding the data. So we'll just run through that quickly. So what we have is we have every combination of our treatments, or what's called a fully crossed design. So we have one treatment is a drought tolerant treatment. So that's a corn cultivar that has been labeled as a drought tolerant cultivar, and then a drought susceptible cultivar. And this was actually done with a bunch of different drought tolerant and different drought susceptible ones. So it's not just a single cultivar that we're talking about here. And then we have treatments that are optimally irrigated versus water stressed. So we're going to have every combination of those treatments, like you see here. So we'll have an optimally irrigated plot that's the drought tolerant variety, as well as an optimally irrigated plot that's the drought susceptible variety, and so on. All right, so what the data kind of look like is this is two different types of spider mites, basically two different life stages that we see in these two different graphs. This graph is going to talk about the motiles. So that's the spider mites that you'd actually see walking around versus the number of eggs that are laid. That's going to be on the right side of this. So we'll see the egg density here and the motile density here. So generally, as we go up on either one of these graphs, we just have more spider mites present. And then we have the irrigation level over on these bottom axes. So on the left side of both, you're going to have an optimally irrigated, where those plants are happy, kind of treatment. And then you're going to have a water stress treatment. And then when you look at these lines, what we're going to see is an open circle is the drought susceptible cultivar, whereas this closed circle here is the drought tolerant cultivar. So what we see across both of these graphs is a pretty similar pattern, where what we have, let's focus on the drought tolerant cultivar first. So this cultivar is good at dealing with drought. Its spider mite density is right here under this circle, unfortunately, but both cultivars, the drought tolerant and the drought susceptible, have about the same density of spider mites under optimal irrigation. So drought tolerant and drought susceptible varieties, when they're optimally irrigated, showed pretty much the same density, both of spider mite adults as well as spider mite eggs. What you see in terms of differences is most interesting when we go to our water stress side of things. So if we take our drought tolerant cultivar, what you see is not actually a statistically significant increase in the number of spider mites that are present on that cultivar. So that drought tolerant cultivar, when it's water stressed, you're not seeing a big boom in population. Even though it's numerically higher, you're really not seeing that. But then with our drought susceptible cultivar, you see way higher number, statistically significantly different, higher number of these spider mites when it's under water stress. And we see, again, a pretty similar pattern over here on the right, where when we have a drought susceptible cultivar that's water stressed, we see this big boom in the number of eggs that are being laid on that cultivar. But we actually see a slight numerical decrease, even though it's not statistically significant. We see a slight decrease in the number of eggs that are laid on a water-stressed but drought-tolerant variety. I guess one thing I'll point out here is that's a really interesting pattern, right? Like we just spent a bunch of time talking about how water stress is oftentimes conducive to insect outbreaks. So what's going on here? I think this is speculation because we didn't analyze this, but keep in mind that when that drought-tolerant cultivar is drought stress, there's going to be upregulation in an increase in some of these things that are helping it be drought tolerant. And sometimes, like we had a list, those same things that make a plant drought tolerant can also make it tolerant to insect damage. So our take-home messages, basically water stress and drought-tolerant corn hybrids reduced the severity of outbreaks when water is limited. So, in essence, if you're in a water-limited situation, it can be a really great thing to use a drought-tolerant variety. Under well-watered conditions, it doesn't really make a difference. And we do have to acknowledge that oftentimes if a plant is resistant to one type of stressor, that comes at a cost. There might be something like if it's constantly devoting energy to resisting a stressor, it's not devoting that same energy to creating yield. So under perfect conditions, sometimes actually having a tolerant variety can be a bad thing because it's wasting energy on defenses that it doesn't need. But at least under water stress conditions, in this system, it can be a really advantageous thing to have that kind of tolerance. Because when there's no difference in outbreaks between our two cultivars under optimal irrigation, it matters less when conditions are perfect. But we are all well aware this year of all years that in the states represented here, usually water can be a limiting factor. Okay, so what can you actually do with this information? So watering precisely is a great one. Knowing your soil and knowing your plants can be a great first step in making sure you're not irrigating too much or too little. Remember that every soil is different. So I'm not a soil scientist, so I will not pretend that I could help with this as much, but getting a soil analysis done, talking to your local extension agent to help understand your soil can be a great way to get started on this. Many people will use what we call the hand feel method, right? Like we know what our soil feels like when it's saturated versus like, if it goes any drier than this, I'm going to start seeing my plants wilt because it can be tricky to play with that lower limit. But that's what we're aiming to do, right? Is get close to that permanent wilting point, but not actually hit it. And the hand feel method, even the reason I have an asterisk beside this is because it can be really imprecise. If this is our first step towards watering better, that's great. But in reality, even the most experienced folks sometimes aren't as accurate as our technology can be. So I consulted our irrigation specialist about this, and she was indicating that oftentimes when you use soil moisture sensors to water more precisely, you can reduce your applied water by 30% is not an uncommon number that she sees. So considering using something like soil moisture sensors placed in a representative location and accurately calibrated and thought out, which is what that Oklahoma State publication I put in the chat earlier can perhaps provide a little bit of guidance on. That can be a great way if you're willing to invest in some soil moisture sensors. What you can do is also water precisely. So water each individual plant in your garden instead of having a sprinkler, a quintessential example. You can do things like design and calibrate a drip system well. Quintessentially, drip might not be an option in every system. So there's again caveats with all of these suggestions. But using a drip system to water your plants really precisely and just how much they need and just the area they need it can be a really great change to your irrigation system. Watering deeply and less often can be good. That's also great for disease avoidance, in all honesty, as well. Watering at times when it's not scaldingly hot. These kind of quintessential things that we all probably find intuitive at a certain point. What else can you do? Honestly, you can just know when to be concerned. You can understand now why insects tend to outbreak under drought stress conditions and be really diligent in your monitoring during those periods of drought. One thing we want to try and do almost in all settings is trying to minimize the overlap in different stressors. So I just picked a couple examples, but doing things like not pruning during a drought, knowing that your plant is already stressed and that might cause additional stress. Caveats with that, but perhaps an example. Don't over or under fertilizing. Fertilizing during a drought can be problematic, so make sure to be diligent in reading your fertilizer label and understanding the implications of applying fertilizer at a certain time. But maybe if you can preemptively ensure that your fertility is good before you're likely to go into a drought stress period, maybe late in the summer, that can help your set your plants up for success. Avoiding soil compaction, all these other things that we do to try and just support overall plant health can help our plants better be able to resist one stressor if they're not kind of dealing with many at the same time. You can select your plants carefully. I will admit that I'm really biased towards this one, but being really thoughtful in the species that you plant can be a great way to worry a little bit less about water limited conditions. There are plants that are just better set up for the climates that we exist in and better set up to tolerate or resist drought stress. So no matter what you're planting, think about the species and then think about the variety. The picture that I have here on the lower right hand of the screen is a big turfgrass trial. This used to be a rain exclusion tent, but basically what this trial was doing is was testing a bunch of different turfgrass cultivars under droughty conditions. If you have a lawn, you can look into turfgrass cultivars that are more resistant to drought. So even if you still have a lawn, you can maybe use a little bit less water. And the same thing goes for all kinds of different varieties. There's a lot of really great research out there that can help recommend some more drought resistant or tolerant varieties of any plant. You can conserve the water that you have in the soil and conserve the water that you apply. This one again comes with a little bit of an asterisk, as it seems like all soil things do, but increasing soil organic matter within reason, if you get a soil test, can be one way to kind of help increase the water retention capacity of your soils. Using mulch and certain ground covers can also be a really prudent thing for us to do. Bare ground loses a lot of water, so we have to be careful with that. And cover crops can be another way that we can conserve water. There is a little bit of a trade-off sometimes, and there's some skepticism surrounding using cover crops because it's a crop, it does use water. But if you thoughtfully select the mix, usually by consulting an expert on cover cropping would be ideal, or that sort of thing. Consult your seed purveyor, but thoughtfully select a mix that's fit for your area, and it's going to end up doing more good in terms of water retention than harm in terms of water use. Bare ground is almost always what we want to avoid. Okay, so let's review. That was a lot of information. So we know that insects often outbreak under drought stress conditions. So things like increased canopy temperatures, increased concentration of plant nutrition, and decreased defenses can all be a problem for us. We know that that's why insects are oftentimes a problem, and drought is a problem too. But you can water precisely, you can conserve the water that you apply, and just kind of understanding what's going on in your system is never going to be a problem. You can understand why your plants might be looking particularly poorly or might suddenly have an insect outbreak under these droughty conditions, and carefully select your plant species and varieties. I will never harp on that one enough. Being thoughtful about what plants you pick is a great way to take advantage of their natural capacity to do good for us. And with that, I can do questions.
Thanks, Desiree. That was a wonderful presentation. I'm going to stop the recording.